Hello everyone and welcome! I've got a couple of nice looking big rigs on the bench today. It's been a busy week for me here at the shop, but I wanted to put together a little video to share with y'all this week, so I thought it would be a good time to do a little bit of maintenance and some upgrades on each of these trucks. Both of these models are sitting on top of our CTC01 3D printable RC chassis, which is specifically designed for 1/24th and 1/25th scale plastic model kits, replicating larger commercial trucks such as this Mack DM800 and GMC General that you see here. The CTC01 provides an easy to 3D print and easy to build functional base with enough room for a detailed interior and engine bay to be added, combining the fun and detail of building a plastic model kit with it actually being able to be driven once finished. The complete design and development process of the CTC01 has been covered in detail in a series here on the channel, as well as the full build process for both the General and DM800. Links to these videos will be below in the description if you'd like to check them out. I really want to start by giving a huge thank you for all of the support here recently, especially all of our new patrons over on Patreon. I'm continuously blown away by everyone's generosity, and whether you're interested in downloading the files and doing a project like this yourself, or just want to live vicariously through these videos that I post here on the channel, it's all very much appreciated. Since its release, the CTC01 has been a very popular design, both for hobbyists interested in 3D printing their own chassis and those who have ordered the kits from our store. We've gotten a ton of great feedback, and considering how much time I spend on some of these tutorial videos and instructions that have been posted, trying to provide you all with as much information as possible, I'm so glad to know that they've been useful to so many builders out there. Though of course, as always, if you ever have any questions along the way, please feel free to send a message and I'll do the best I can to help. Seriously, some of these tutorial videos take a long time to make, and I'm just trying to remember to include every little step and detail along the way, and I'm hoping that people will be able to follow along and build the same thing, so it really does mean a lot more than you know when people find them helpful and are able to build these chassis. I don't want to just drop a bunch of STL files and say good luck. I really want to make the assembly process as straightforward as possible and provide some tutorials, information, and full build examples to go along with each release. Though of course this is with the understanding that simply due to the nature of these custom plastic model to RC conversions, every project is going to be a little bit different. Obviously some custom work is always going to be required, and a little bit of problem solving will likely be necessary at certain points. That's all part of the fun and challenge though of this niche of the hobby. I don't think these projects will ever be as straightforward as clicking together Legos or building a 10-scale RC Tamiya kit, but I do the best I can to provide some helpful information and finished examples, which can be used as reference. But with this in mind, and to answer a few frequently asked questions, we received some comments asking if there's any plans to scale this chassis up to 1/18th or 1/14th or 1/10th scale, and currently there are no plans to make this chassis in any other size. The CTC01 was really designed specifically to fit 1/24th and 1/25th scale plastic model kits, of which there are a plethora to choose from. Keep in mind, simply scaling up this chassis to a larger size would mean that the non-3D printable components, such as the motors and steering servo, would no longer fit. You can 3D print all of these parts in any size that you want, but that doesn't mean that the parts that you don't 3D print are going to magically adjust their size accordingly. If you're interested in a larger scale RC semi-truck platform, I'd recommend looking into some of the kits available from Tamiya. Another frequently asked question is whether or not there will be a chassis with a more authentic drivetrain and suspension layout. As you may be aware with the CTC01, it has a very simple, functional, and durable motor on axle design, but it's not the most realistic looking by any means. At this time, there are no immediate plans to deviate from the simplistic design that we have here with the CTC01, but maybe someday in the future, a chassis with a more authentic design, more in line with the realism I've been able to achieve with some of the car and light truck models I've built, would be doable here with these larger big rigs. Again though, if that type of detail is a priority, I would suggest looking into the numerous kits available from Tamiya, as well as some of the aftermarket parts that are available for those kits. Those Tamiya semis are epic and can be built extremely lifelike and with incredible power, though they don't come cheap. With those being in a larger scale, that certainly makes incorporating these drivetrain and suspension details a lot easier, although I do like that with the motors in the rear and the electronics hidden between the frame rails on the CTC01, we have plenty of room for a detailed engine bay and interior, something to appeal a little bit more to the plastic model builder, but the Tamiya platforms are definitely the way to go if you want more drivetrain and suspension detail. And then finally, we get asked a lot whether or not these trucks or chassis are available fully built or ready to run, And the answer is simply no. We do have some kits available that don't require any 3D printing on our website, but there's no plans to sell anything that's ready to run or fully built. Honestly, I feel like to get the most out of this niche of the RC hobby, you really have to not just tolerate, but truly enjoy the process of building these models, especially when you consider the performance probably won't be anything to write home about once complete. If you want a ready-to-run RC vehicle, there's tons of options available on the market. And if you want a nice-looking pre-built static model or die-cast to collect and display on a shelf, there's tons of options for that as well. Maybe nothing exactly like these 1/25th scale rigs that you see here, but there are tons of other options for folks not interested in embarking on a custom project like this. We've sort of carved out a nice niche with what we're doing here, and for now we're sticking to it. But speaking of sticking to it though, the battery box there, at least that's what I think this is on the GMC General, definitely needs a bit of glue. This truck was the first model that I built using the CTC01 a few years back, and it's been holding up pretty well. Naturally though, when you're using these plastic model kits, which were not exactly designed to be handled or actually driven, things are going to be quite fragile, so keep that in mind, as well as expect a little bit of maintenance to be necessary from time to time, as well as needing to re-glue some stuff. I've said this before in these videos, but you'll definitely want to make sure that all of these tiny parts and pieces are well secured in place on these functional RC models, so that they don't rattle off while driving. Even concrete or pavement that might look smooth when standing on it can be quite bumpy when you shrink down to the scale of these vehicles. All that rattling around can knock lights and lenses and other small components loose, and if that happens, good luck finding them. Fortunately, everything has been hanging on both with this truck and trailer so far. All those tiny little lights are still there. It's one thing when you're gluing together parts for a model that's going to sit on a shelf, but it's another when it's actually going to be driven around and handled on a more frequent basis. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this GMC General and trailer turned out. I definitely found the older tooling and part fitment of this particular kit to be a little bit of a challenge, but in the end I think it came out alright, though definitely a few things I would do differently next time. The windows, for example, have certainly seen some better days. I had to jam them in there during the assembly process, and as you could see, some cracks have formed throughout. There's also a ton of unsightly haze from the glue that was used. I've tried to fix that on a few occasions, with it obviously not working out. There's two things I would have done differently here if I was to do it again. Number one, I'd ensure I'm using some clear drying glue. Using something like Mod Podge would avoid any of this haze appearing. And then I would also cut that single clear window piece that this model kit came with into 3 individual sections, one for the windshield and then the 2 side windows. I'd mock them up, modify them as needed, and then glue them individually into place. Obviously for me, just jamming that single clear piece into place was way too tight and resulted in these cracks. I wouldn't even worry too much about cutting up that window piece, since as long as the windshield comes out undamaged and can be glued into place, the side windows appear to be completely flat, so I could always just use any old piece of clear plastic for them. For what it's worth, that's just my suggestion of what I'd do if I was to build this particular model kit again. I don't know how, but maybe I somehow messed up the installation of that clear window piece, which resulted in these cracks. I don't really know what I could have done differently though. It's not like I shrank the size of the cab prior to installing that window piece. As for the haze, I have tried a few things to get rid of it. This is obviously a good example of why you use a clear drying glue on clear parts, so you can avoid this. There also appears to have been way too much glue being applied. I've tried using things like Goo Gone and alcohol to remove that haze, but what I decided to try today was applying some floor polish to see if that would permanently, I guess not really remove, but kind of lessen the appearance of that haze, and it actually seems to have turned out looking pretty nice, as you can see here. I was able to reach in there with a cotton swab and apply it to the inside of the windows. Not perfect by any means, but I definitely think it looks better. Like I said, the General has actually been holding up really well, so I'm going to set that vehicle aside for now and turn my attention to this more recent build, the Mack DM800. Overall, I was really happy with how this truck turned out. Once again, I did find that the model kits could be a little bit tricky to put together and get everything lined up as good as possible, but this is sort of the beauty of building some of these older trucks. You can kind of get away with imperfections and stuff not quite lining up. Combine that with sort of this mild patina look I went for with this rig, and it looks pretty good. There are, however, a few things that I wanted to address today, some of which I talked about at the end of that full build video. The first thing I wanted to do, which was actually a bit of a fail, was repair this headlight. I added both headlights and taillights to this rig, which look awesome, especially that warm glow there on the headlights. But pretty much immediately after putting this truck together, I noticed that the right side headlight was not always functioning, and if I jiggled one of the connectors, it would turn on and off, so I was pretty confident I knew what the issue was, and if I resoldered this connection, it would go back to working. That, however, was not the case though. I resoldered a couple of different connections, and after a while, would eventually conclude that the LED seems to be bad, as it should be getting power. I had spent enough time this evening messing with the lights, and I really wasn't interested in ripping it out and replacing it, so again, with it being an older truck, we're just gonna say one of the headlights is bad. How about that? Now this was another thing I mentioned towards the end of that full build video, and it's a very minor thing, but it's also a very easy fix. And that's just the fact that there's so much room between the floor of the cab and the top of the chassis, to the point where you can just see right through it at certain angles. To me, this gap just looks a little bit too large, and I wanted to kind of cover it up. All I did was cut a couple of pieces of styrene to the correct size, and then glued them to the bottom of the cab, later painting them matte black so they'll blend in. A minor detail, but something I think will help further enhance the lifelike appearance. While I had that matte black paint out, I also covered up some of the electronics and wires, then did some touch up in a few spots on both trucks, again trying to get everything to blend in and look more authentic. Once that was done, one of the more significant things I wanted to address was the rear suspension. As you can see, there really isn't a lot of travel, and it's not very flexible. By no means is this truck going to be a crawler, but I really wanted to see if I could soften it up a bit for when I'm driving over terrain like this, just to get a little bit more suspension movement when it's going over the bumps. Now, if you know anything about the very simple rear suspension design of the CTC01, you'll know that it's not exactly designed to provide much flex. But even with this in mind, I wanted to see what I could do to sort of loosen things up. I was actually able to achieve a pretty good result, which you'll see in just a minute. But what I did first was disassemble everything and remove the motor mounts from each motor. Basically, what I want to do is get a lot more slop out of these motor mounts. Making these have a much looser fit is going to allow the axle to move in some ways that I want them to move, and in some ways that maybe I really don't want them to move. But it's not like I'm going to be driving this truck down the highway at 60 miles per hour, to where having a bunch of slop in the rear is going to be a problem. So in this particular context, I'd rather have things be looser and have a fair bit of slop. Basically, all I did was sand down the outer edges of the motor mounts, since normally they fit pretty snug between the frame rails, which helps eliminate any lateral axle movement or twisting. And then I also not only bored out the holes that the M3 hardware fits into to be a bit larger, but also enlarged both ends with a reamer. Notice how much of a looser fit they are now. They can do more than just pivot up and down, but they can twist side to side. Like I said, this is going to allow the rear axles to move in some ways that aren't exactly desirable, but in this particular context, I'd rather have that extra bit of flex. From here, I was definitely on the right track, but I noticed that there wasn't quite enough room between the bottom of the fifth wheel mount and the tops of the motors to allow as much suspension travel as what I'd like to have with this truck. This is in part due to having these wires here that supply power to the taillights running over top of the motors. Having some thinner gauge wire here would definitely be ideal, but what I ended up doing was creating a new fifth wheel mount that sits 5mm higher. I got this new part 3D printed and installed, which allows much more room for the motors and the wires, but also now positions the fifth wheel pretty high. Possibly too high, but we'll have to see how it looks with the trailer that I'm building for this Mack. But with this fifth wheel mount now being positioned much higher up, I need to cut some new, much longer springs. To prevent the springs from collapsing, or getting pushed over to the side rather than compressing, what I did was cut and slide on a similar size piece of shrink tubing and heat them up to help support the springs and give them some rigidity. I also used some tiny rubber bands to help hold each set of springs together, again making them more sturdy and less likely to bend over and collapse when the suspension compresses. Not at all a very elegant or high-tech solution here for the rear suspension, but it's dirt cheap and it works great, so I'm going to go with it. Now that freshly 3D printed part didn't quite match the rest of the truck, so I did some painting and weathering to help it blend right in. Yeah, that fifth wheel mount definitely sits a little high there on the chassis, but the results are way better. The rear suspension is a lot softer and definitely more flexible. Again, not a crawler by any means, but that's not the goal here. I'm hoping that when I get this thing back out onto those trails, it'll be a little less rigid. Although as some people pointed out during that prior full build video, apparently these trucks would have rode pretty rough over terrain like this, especially with no load on the back. Still though, I would like to see some more movement from that rear suspension. But if any of you CTC01 builders out there would like to get a little more movement out of your rear suspension, consider trying something similar. Just be aware that this will introduce quite a bit of slop into these rear axles, so as long as you're okay with that, it should work pretty well. With the single pivot point rear suspension and motor mount assembly that the CTC01 has, it's never going to perfectly replicate the rear suspension of the real thing. But without having to go to the trouble of completely redesigning the suspension, just a little bit of hacking and drilling was able to deliver a decent enough result. But with that done, both of these trucks are ready to hit the road once again, or maybe more specifically, cruise some laps around the parking lot and on these dirt trails. Once again, I want to give a huge thank you for all of the positive feedback on the CTC01 platform, and it's certainly been a big motivator for me to want to do some more big rig builds and tinker with this platform more. Lots of cool stuff in the works, but that's all I've got for today's video. As always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.